welcome to you all. Thank you very much for coming to what is the third DPP lecture. The death penalty project, as many of you will know, but perhaps not all of you, has been in existence now for 20 years. And during that time, it's worked to protect human rights, the human rights of those facing the death penalty. And as a result of this work, the mandatory death penalty has been abolished in 10 Caribbean countries, as well as in Uganda, Kenya and Malawi, and the lives have been saved of hundreds facing execution. That work, as many of you will know, has been led by Saul Lefrand and Pervez Jabbar, who run this organization. I'm effectively an onlooker. This is an opportunity, though, for me to thank them both for the incredible work that they do. The pair of them are indefatigable, intrepid, and they need to be with the sort of work they do and the travelling that they do. We are extremely grateful to them for the energy they put into this difficult work, challenging but successful over the past years, as I've said. It's also an opportunity for me to thank those of you, our principal funders, and many individuals who fund the organisation. Without that money, we simply wouldn't exist, and Saul and Pervez would be out of a job. But thank you all very much indeed, and they include the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture, and a number of charitable organisations, foundations, trusts and foundations, including the Sigrid Rousing Trust, the Oak Foundation, and the Open Society Foundation. As I say, we're grateful to you all. Without you, you are the lifeblood, in effect, of this project. Also, a thank you is necessary for those volunteers, in effect, that army of barristers, army of medics, psychiatrists, doctors who support us, and the academics who've supported this project now for many years. And before I forget, because I know I'm about to do that, I should also mention in the same breath, I should have done as Pervez and Saul, the huge assistance they get, and they're responsible for organising this evening, from Annette So and Nicola Finch. Among those academics who have supported this project is Bill Shebas. Professor Bill Shebas, sure is known to many of you, if not all of you. He's the Professor of International Law at Middlesex University in London. He's also Professor of International Human Law and Human Rights at Leiden University, Emeritus Professor of Human Rights Law at the National University of Ireland, Galway, an Honorary Chairman of the Irish Centre for Human Rights. He was invited visiting scholar at the Paris School of International Affairs, the Sciences Politiques, Honorary Professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, visiting Fellow of Kellogg College at the University of Oxford, and Professeur Associé at the Université du Québec à Montréal. I hope I pronounced that. Montréal, actually, that should be. He is also the author of more than 20 books dealing in whole or in part with international human rights law and the death penalty. And he's also published more than 300 articles in academic journals, principally in the field of international human rights law and international criminal law. His writings have been translated into over 10 languages. From 2002 to 2004, he served as one of 3 international members of the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Bill has worked as a consultant on capital punishment for the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime and drafted the 2010 report of the Secretary General on the status of the death penalty. He was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2006. He was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 2007, and he's been awarded the Vespasian V. Pella Medal for International Criminal Justice of the Association Internationale de Droit Pénal and the Gold Medal in the Social Sciences at the Royal Irish Academy. Impressive, Bill. Now it just remains for me to welcome Bill, who is going to deliver tonight's lecture. Bill, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, and particularly to Pervez and Saul for inviting me, giving me this honor to deliver this prestigious lecture tonight in this very elegant venue. It's a great pleasure, and it's wonderful to see so many old and new friends here among us as well this evening. Some years ago, I was off to a conference on the death penalty, and Penelope, who's here tonight, asked me where it was, and I said, I'm going to Brazil, to Sao Paulo. And she said, do they have the death penalty still in Brazil? And I said, well, not really. They've actually abolished the death penalty pretty much everywhere in Latin America. And she said, so why are you going? Why do you need to go if they've abolished the death penalty? And I sort of made a promise that I would resist doing talks that one might call preaching to the converted. But you have to make an exception to every rule. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that, although I wonder I might be the only person here in the room who actually thinks we'll get to universal abolition of the death penalty in the next decade. So let me try and set out the case for that. One of the things that has struck me in recent years, lecturing on the issue of capital punishment, teaching it to students in different parts of the world, is how over the course of a few generations, countries that no longer have the death penalty, we find that young people in those countries no longer see it as part of a criminal justice system that's familiar to them. It's medieval, it's barbaric, it's from the past, like those strange tortures that you see on television, or that if you go to a city that has a torture museum and you see these strange implements and say, isn't that crazy, 300-400 years ago people did that sort of thing. And I have the impression that in many countries, including Britain, certainly Ireland and Canada and other places that I'm familiar with, where the death penalty is a thing of the relatively distant past now, as a reality, that it's no longer something that's part of the debate among younger people. It's different, I think, with those of us who have lived with a little bit of death penalty in some way or another in our lives. I still remember, as a boy, learning about it. I grew up in Canada, as you might hear, and I remember as a boy a case of a young man, he was an adolescent, he was a little older than me, he was 14 years of age, Stephen Truscott was his name, and he was charged with murdering and raping a young woman about his own age. He had a quick trial, he was convicted and sentenced to death at the age of 14. I guess I was about 11 at the time. And I can remember just being stunned at the idea that someone not very much older than me could be sentenced to death. Incidentally, it all took place in a little town called Clinton in southwestern Ontario. It might be a little better known today because that's where Alice Munro comes from, who won the Nobel Prize, a town of 3,000 people, and you'll know the town if you've read her stories. But she perhaps knew Stephen Truscott when she lived there, and she might have known the victim as well, or certainly the families, because it was that size of a town. At the time, the Canadian government routinely commuted sentences when juvenile offenders were involved. So he actually wasn't going to be executed. He was executed because he was tried as an adult. That was possible under Canadian law with the people in that intermediate category of 14 to 18. And the death penalty, of course, as many of you know, was mandatory. One of the gifts that Britain gave to the legal systems of its colonies. The death penalty from that point on, I should add that Stephen Truscott was later found to have been wrongfully convicted. He was paroled, then there was a new hearing, and he was formally acquitted. The Canadian government or the government of the province paid him several $1 million in compensation for the wrongful conviction. But as a boy of 14, he was sentenced to death, and I think that must have, I can recall it, and I can recall how disturbing that was. I can't say that the issue of capital punishment played a big role in my life and my thinking for many years after that. I was much more concerned about matters like apartheid in South Africa, racial discrimination in the United States, the war in Vietnam, and I think I kind of stumbled on the issue of the death penalty as a doctoral student. There are some doctoral students here tonight, and they know how difficult it is to find the right topic. I sort of stumbled upon it, and here was this issue of the death penalty in international law, and I wrote my thesis on it. It was around 1991, I should say, with apologies to Philip Larkin, that the death penalty for me began in 1991, somewhere between the decision in Suring and Pratt and Morgan. So it was in that period when a great deal was happening. The important decision of the European Court of Human Rights on the death row phenomenon and on extradition, and then the great judgment of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council that in many ways completed the Suring decision. Amnesty International had just published a very influential book in the late 80s called When the State Kills, which documented the status of the death penalty. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot of activity. The second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights had been adopted only a year earlier. But it wasn't as if anyone could say at the time in the early 1990s that this was a pronounced and exciting trend towards abolition of the death penalty. Some of you may remember that as well. It's very hard, of course, to go back 25 years and imagine what we were thinking and forget about all that we've learned since then. In preparation for this lecture, I went back and looked at Amnesty International's book, and they talked about how there was slow progress towards abolition. They pointed out that one country every year over the previous decade, the 1980s, had abolished the death penalty. But they still had 100 countries that were using it, so you could do the math and figure that it would take about a century at that rate to get to universal abolition. There were negative judgments as well. So in between Suring and Pratt and Morgan, there was a very perverse decision by the Supreme Court of Canada that went entirely in the other direction. And on the political front, it wasn't straightforward either. In the General Assembly, Italy tried to get a resolution on a moratorium in 1994, and it was shot down in flames. It was a disaster, the Italian effort in 1994, and it was only until 2007 that it was finally possible to get that resolution through the United Nations General Assembly. It's a relatively recent development. It was shot down thanks to the efforts of some of the usual suspects at the time, Singapore, Egypt in particular, ganged up with procedural techniques, what were called wrecking amendments to undermine the Italian resolution. It was about that time I'd finished my thesis that I started attending meetings that were being organized by this sort of interesting community of people who work on the death penalty, a mix of academics and of lawyers and of activists. And I remember the first such meeting I went to, called by Amnesty International in Boston, I think in 1993. And that was where I met two of the iconic figures, academic scholars really the doyen of the field, Hugo Adam Badeau, who sadly passed away a year and a half ago, and of course the great Roger Hood, who I think delivered this lecture some years ago. I think I met them in the bar at the Holiday Inn, actually. I think there was a rival session going on death row poetry, and Roger and Hugo had decided to sit that one out. Roger was having his trademark dry martini in the bar, and I joined him there for that. And it wasn't the last time Roger and I have had a dry martini together, I can assure you. Just for the record, it's a Tanqueray gin, a little bit of Noye Prat, and a twist, stirred, not shaken. Okay, Roger and I have done these in Indonesia and China, all over the world, at lectures on capital punishment. Then things started to change in practice around the world, and all of a sudden, what Amnesty had spotted as one state a year abolishing the death penalty jumped to about 3, and there were some phenomenal developments as well. I think in 1994, I attended a meeting in Geneva at the United Nations on the death penalty, and I sat on a panel with a Russian and a South African, and we spoke about the death penalty. All of us abolitionists, of course, and I gave my little speech about, abolition, international law, and so on. And then the South African took the floor and said, it's very nice what you say, but in our country, we have the highest rates of murder in the world. And we have the highest crime rates, violent crime, and people believe in the death penalty, 90%, 95%. We'll never abolish the death penalty in South Africa. And then the Russian guy took the floor and he said, South Africa is a picnic compared to Russia. I said, in Russia, we really love the death penalty. We really have violent crime, and it's impossible. We could never abolish the death penalty in Russia. And a year later, South Africa abolished the death penalty, and 2 years later, Russia effectively abolished the death penalty. Russia finally stopped using it and has never returned to it. So that taught me that the change on this subject happens really very dramatically, and it started to become evident that it would happen much faster than we expected, this move towards abolition. About that time, the majority tipped in the world, the balance, so that we could say a majority of countries in the world no longer use the death penalty, and that's obviously continued to this point. And you'll see on the little handout, the little piece of paper that I've distributed to you, that over the last 5 years, only about 30 countries have carried out executions. And Amnesty International every year does a report on this that points out that only about 20 in any given year actually conduct the death penalty. Roger Hood, who I've already mentioned, prepared the reports for the United Nations for 2 decades. These reports that come out every 5 years are we call them the quinquennial reports. They started in 1974, and they provide a very good way of measuring, sort of a benchmark every 5 years to have a look at where the progress of the death penalty, or the status of the death penalty. At the beginning, it wasn't even clear it was progress, where that is. In fact, in the 1980s, in one of the reports, the Secretary General said, there's no perceptible trend one way or another towards abolition of the death penalty. No trend at all. That was about 30 years ago that statement was made. I recall a great Sir Leon Radzinowicz, who was collaborated with Roger Hood on other work, made a statement in the late 90s where he said he thought that the death penalty had that abolition had run its course and that there wasn't going to be much more development. In other words, we had the countries that were going to get rid of the death penalty had done it, and that we were now in a kind of a steady state situation, and there wasn't going to be much more abolition because what was left were the hardcore, the tough nuts. Roger Hood, in his reports for the United Nations, started in his final report in 2004 to have a look at what might be called the hardcore. And I want to say a few words about that. That's what that chart is about, that table. You see, the reports that have been done by the United Nations historically, as well as the studies by Amnesty International, have often, I think, tended to take a rather binary approach to looking at the subject. So we have two classes, abolitionist and retentionist. And we explain the development by saying there are so many abolitionist states and so many retentionist states. At one point, actually very early in the studies, the United Nations attempted to try and nuance a little bit the abolitionist category. So the abolitionist category was divided into three parts. Part of that, I think, was just a gambit to beef up the number of abolitionist states. Because if you looked at it in 1974, in the first report, and even in some of the subsequent reports, there were very few countries that had abolished the death penalty altogether, in law, de jure. And so the United Nations report said, well, we have to look at a couple of other features of this. One are the states that have abolished the death penalty for ordinary crimes. So some states, many states, I think that was the case here as well in the United Kingdom, stopped using the death penalty for all practical purposes, for murder, as well as for any other crimes that might have been, for which it might have been available, but retained it either for wartime offenses, military justice, treason, and so on. So it was said it was kind of an approximate category, but the idea was that if you didn't use it for ordinary offenses, you were already halfway there. And in fact, in the first report by the Secretary General in 1974, there were more states that were halfway there that had abolished the death penalty for ordinary crimes than there were that had abolished it altogether. And let me say that that category of the abolition for ordinary crimes has become absolutely insignificant over the years. It's absolutely insignificant. There are still a handful of states in that class. There are a few of them that were at the time and have never moved, like Israel, which retained the death penalty for genocide, used it once 50 years ago, and has never used it since. But really, it's become insignificant because today, virtually all states that abolish the death penalty do it in one sweep, abolish it altogether. The other category, which in many ways is the most interesting, is kind of on the fence between abolition and retention. These are the countries that are de facto abolitionist. And that category has continued to grow very dramatically. It's now 50 or more states are in that category. According to the United Nations, these are countries that have not used the death penalty for 10 years, not carried it out. Many of them continue to sentence because it's in their law, they can't do anything about it, but in practice, it's not carried out. And so in the early reports, the UN started saying they're also in the abolitionist category. One of the things that I decided to look at in the last report 5 years ago was how reliable that was as an indicator of the direction the country was moving in. After all, one can say no country is immune to restoring the death penalty. There was some crackpot parliamentarian who attempted to, well, I hope he's not here tonight, but who, I doubt it, who had a private member's bill to restore the death penalty here. And I gather it's just been withdrawn. But, you know, it could be adopted, and then Britain would withdraw from the European Union because it would have to. Maybe that was the hidden agenda all along. And it would have to withdraw from the Council of Europe. I mean, it's theoretically possible. Just as it's theoretically possible we could have a fascist coup d'etat and they could decide to reinstate the death penalty. But in the normal state of affairs, it's not likely to happen. We know, we're fairly confident that in a country that has abolished the death penalty in law, ratified the international treaties on capital punishment, as is the case here in the United Kingdom, that abolition, that a return to the death penalty is a very, very theoretical proposition. Can we say the same about the states that have abolished the death penalty de facto, that is, haven't used it for 10 years? And what I concluded after looking at this over a 30 or 40-year period in the final report, in the previous report, was that it's a very reliable indicator. If they go 10 years without an execution, they almost never go back. In fact, in the 5-year period that I studied, which was 2004 to 2009, nobody went back. In the next report, we have one notorious case, Gambia. Is the Gambia an indicator that this is fragile or that something is strange is happening? I don't think so. I think that all that's going on is that something very strange is happening in the Gambia. They have a weird president, and so this is something unusual has happened that isn't really indicative of any more profound change going on. But the category that was never really explored in depth, and that Roger Hood started to do and that I've tried to pursue, is the category of the states that still use the death penalty. Because if there is a very important trend, there's certainly an important trend towards abolition, but what trends can we see in the states that actually conduct the death penalty? So what Roger did was he identified the states, he took it was an arbitrary figure, but it was a way of looking at what might be called the hardcore of the states that execute. Countries that have had 20 or more executions in the 5-year period of the report. And he looked at that, and in his report he identified 26 states that had executed more than 20. We could call that the hardcore. I've been back once and looked at it, and what you have there is an updated study of that same phenomenon that looks at it now over a 20-year period, about the states that are the serious, enthusiastic practitioners of execution over the previous 2 decades. There are actually 32 of them. There were a few that weren't on the original list. I think that part of that is that they may have graduated into the 20 category and hadn't been, or there wasn't reliable data. And there are a couple of non-UN member states that now figure in the report, Taiwan and Palestine. So here's the bottom line of what these figures show. Of the 32 states that have been hardcore practitioners of the death penalty over the last 20 years, 14 of them are now abolitionists. 14 out of 32 hardcore practitioners of the death penalty are abolitionists, either in law or in practice. And that's what that table shows. It gets better. Because of the 18 that remain, 9 of them are no longer on the list, because they have dramatically reduced the number of executions, and they are no longer in the 20 category. We can also see this intuitively in different parts of the world, where we see the death penalty on the death penalty map, where it just seems to be evaporating. So we could start with the Western Hemisphere. Really, today now, there's only one country that's actually carrying out executions. There are different explanations. Some of it is the historic opposition in Latin America to the death penalty and political changes in that part of the world. Part of it is the heroic, energetic efforts of Pervez and Saul and many of the barristers here in this room fighting the cases in the Commonwealth Caribbean. In the United States, the numbers continue to shrink. I think that the United States is now at the lowest numbers since the death penalty was revived in the 1970s in terms of death sentences that are pronounced each year. So it continues to shrink. The number of states that employ the death penalty continue to shrink. We could turn to Africa. A few years ago, if I was lecturing on the subject, I would say, well, the death penalty has almost disappeared in Africa, except for a pocket in the northeast corner: Sudan, Egypt, Libya, and Somalia. But Egypt and Libya have not executed anybody in 3 years, since the Arab Spring began. I don't know where that's going. It's certainly too early to make firm predictions about that, but something's happening. Something interesting is happening in that part of the world. And so the death penalty really is confined to Asia, and really quite regionally there as well, according to the chart. The only countries where the death penalty has actually increased in recent years are the countries of Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, in a small number of countries in that part of the world. Last week I was at the UN headquarters in New York for a meeting organized by the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the death penalty. It took place under the co-sponsorship of the Philippines and Chile, 30 years ago, they were both dictatorships where executions were carried out. Today, they're militant abolitionist democracies. A number of delegations came. I was there with Carolyn Hoyle from Oxford and Jeff Fagan from Columbia University. We were the specialists talking about the subject. The EU ambassadors came, or their representatives, and they made their usual perfunctory statements about the death penalty, predictable, that was fine. What was very striking in the room was that some of the other countries who attended, China attended, Singapore attended, and Egypt attended. Now, in previous decades, Egypt and Singapore have been, if not the greatest practitioners of the death penalty, certainly the most militant, shrill, excitable defenders of it. They're always there in the UN trying to sabotage a resolution. They came to the meeting. China, a little more subdued in the UN debates, but as everybody knows, the biggest practitioner of the death penalty in the world. Well, the representative of Singapore from the Singapore embassy and from Egypt, they both took the floor. They had already been complimented in our speeches because we pointed out how the numbers had declined in those two countries quite dramatically in recent years, and they seemed almost flattered. So they didn't get up and say, but the death penalty is not a human rights issue, we're opposed to these resolutions. They seemed to welcome the praise, and they spoke in a very constructive and positive manner. The Chinese delegate took the floor to thank us for our presentations and asked if we could make any further recommendations to China about how they could reduce the death penalty more than they've already done. So this is anecdotal, of course, but these were three countries, they're all on the list of the hardcore. But the discourse has really changed so very dramatically in those three countries. Well, does that get me to 10 years to abolition? I don't know. I could do a mathematical calculation, but it is unpredictable. I'm fond of describing it with a kind of an image that it's probably not so good in this part of the world when you grow up in the subarctic, as I did in Canada, in Montreal and Toronto. You're used to a phenomenon it's not even late spring, it's sort of the fag end of winter when there are huge piles of ice and they sort of slowly start to melt and all the garbage accumulates, and then one day they just sort of disappear. I suppose Greenland will be like that in 20 years, where the ice will finally just go, and it all happens very quickly. And I just have this sense about the death penalty. Every time you blink, you close your eyes and you open them again, and there's so much less of it around, and there's so many of these sometimes subtle changes, like the conduct. Forget about the statistics. The conduct of the government of China and of Singapore and of Egypt in that meeting in the United Nations last week. A couple of years ago, I attended a meeting at Harvard University that was convened by two of the United Nations special rapporteurs who deal with the death penalty, the rapporteur on torture and the rapporteur on summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions. We had a very interesting working meeting, and as a kind of a little treat, the organizers invited Steven Pinker, Harvard psychology professor, public intellectual. Some of you will know his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is available in all good bookshops. It's out in the Penguin paperback. It's a fascinating book, and he spoke to us about the book. His thesis, basically, is that the world is a less and less violent place, that we are far less likely to die a violent death than at any time in human history. And he gives a number of examples. He's not a lawyer, of course, he's a psychologist, so he's looking at he relates this all to human behavior. He talks a lot about wars, and it's interesting now we're at the beginning of the commemorations of the First World War. I was looking out at my classroom full of students yesterday at Middlesex University and realizing that if it had been a century ago, about a third of the boys in the class would be dead within 18 months. And that kind of an idea is just so far from our thinking today. There's a think tank in Geneva that gives us a number every year on deaths in armed conflict. They issued their report a few months ago, rather, and they calculated that last year there were 60,000 deaths in armed conflict. It's an appalling figure. It's a terrible number. But compare that with the first half of the 20th century, during those wars, when if we make allowance for the change in the global population, which is now 3.5 times what it was in 1914 or 1939, about 60,000 people a day were being killed during those periods of war in the first half of the 20th century. And that doesn't happen anymore. Now we talk about 60,000 a year, not a day, and we find that to be an appalling number. Well, Pinker, of course, in his book also looks at the subject of capital punishment, and he discusses it. And some of the facts and figures that I've been referring to, he also refers to. He looks back over centuries, also points to the fact that the death penalty is less and less brutal in the way it's imposed, that it's not associated with torture, things that we all know and that are familiar to us. But he adds that as fuel to his argument. He actually attended our session, and we spoke about this, and he was very interested. He was intrigued by the legal aspects, which is the part that, of course, concerns many of us here, including myself. But he doesn't write about that in his book. I think he doesn't actually... He would see law perhaps as just being a consequence of the changes in human behavior, and maybe that's part of the story. But I like to think that law is actually a bigger piece of the change, that the law is not only reacting to these changes in human behavior, but it's also promoting them and encouraging them and changing them. And of course, again, let me pay tribute to many of the people who are in this room who've contributed to this. I see Colin Nichols there, who took the Suring case to the European Court of Human Rights, people who did the litigation in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council over the years, and in many of the other national courts in the Caribbean, but elsewhere, Singapore and Uganda, and so on. And of course, the changes to international law, to which all of our efforts in one way or another have contributed. I do think that this is all part of a process underway that Pinker writes about, that we demonstrate in the numbers and in the evolution on the subject of the death penalty. It's all about how we are increasingly, as humans, as human society, recognizing the sanctity, cherishing the sanctity of human life and of human dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that powerful, illuminating, and optimistic lecture. Thank you very much. What we're going to do now is, for the next 15, 20 minutes, take questions. There will be a roving mic. Will you please make sure you've got the microphone in your hand before you ask any questions or answer any questions? Because it's being recorded, and it won't record unless you've actually got it in your hand. So, shall I stay here? Why don't you stay there? Yes. Okay. Julian, microphone on the way.
Thanks very much. I'm Julian Knowles. Bill, thank you very much. Great speech, as always. I was very interested to hear what you said about your 10-year rule, and the question's really this, and with a focus obviously on the English-speaking Commonwealth Caribbean, where the Death Penalty Project does a great deal of work. What do you think it will take to actually push the English-speaking Commonwealth over the edge to actually be de jure abolitionists rather than de facto? The reason I asked that question is, coming to mind, I think St Kitts had 10 years. They had an execution in 98, and then they had one in 2008, so there was a 10-year delay there. And I also think the Bahamas also had a 10-year gap between executions. So certainly there's a worrying trend that years can go by in the Caribbean, and then they suddenly will carry out an execution for whatever reason. What do you think it will take to actually push the English-speaking Caribbean to de jure abolition rather than just de facto?
I don't know. There are different routes that states go through in how they abolish the death penalty, and it's very hard to predict how the route that different countries will take. I feel fairly confident looking at the United States that it will be a judgment of the Supreme Court at some point, fairly soon, depending on how successful President Obama is in replacing a few of the, let me think of the right term, the less sympathetic, the less charming, not charming, that's not the right word, you know who I mean. A few replacements. I don't want to wish evil on, I don't want to wish bad luck on anybody, but let's just hope that Obama gets to change a few of the justices at the Supreme Court. But other countries, we know that many of them do it because they want international respectability. Maybe that is a powerful indicator. Maybe political leaders also, their perceptions change about how committed public opinion is to the death penalty. And I think that's probably, we shouldn't disregard that either, that many politicians are nervous because they think it's a career-ending move to be opposed to the death penalty in some jurisdictions. It certainly is. But maybe they sense something that we're increasingly aware of. Public opinion, it is fickle. But even when you look at countries like China, you find that not only is it's not as extreme as one might think, but it doesn't matter that much to people either. People wake up in the morning. Capital punishment's not the first of their concerns. There are a lot more important things for them in their lives. Maybe that will influence them as well. It is very hard, though, to predict. The governments seem relatively stable parliamentary democracies for the large part. So I don't think we're looking at political upheavals in that sense. One of the problems, too, of course, is that the English-speaking Caribbean, although we think of it sitting in London as being in the shadow of the former colonial master, it's really as much in the shadow of the country to the north. It's more of a Caribbean phenomenon where the Caribbean includes Florida and Texas and Louisiana and so on.
Martin Barrow. I've been involved for many years in abolition in Asia and was particularly involved in abolition in Hong Kong 20 years ago before the handover. I remember at that time I was accused in the media of imposing Western cultural imperialism on the people of Hong Kong, but it went through and it's never come back. Now, excellent work is done by you and many other people, including the wonderful book by Dr. Mai Sato here and others. But I think in parallel to that, what would be enormously helpful would be a one-page sheet, the 5 key arguments against the death penalty. There's a lot of good papers, but encapsulating it into a short, simple argument. Now, whether you could tell us now what are the 5 key arguments, I don't know. I used to use in Hong Kong the fact that there was no evidence in any culture of deterrent and a number of other points like that. But I think something like that would be enormously useful to all of us. Thank you.
Let me just say that different arguments resonate with different people, and it's not as if there's going to be one killer argument that's going to add up to 51% of the population of a country. It's rather a combination. So there are many people who actually will not say that they're opposed to the death penalty in principle, but they're opposed to it being used under the circumstances of the way it's employed. In the United States, you have a lot of that. Because of the racial injustice in the way it's imposed, because of the danger of convicting the innocent. Certainly the deterrence argument to which you've referred is not, there's a very powerful, very persuasive study by the National Academy of Science, I think it's called, in the United States a couple of years ago, that said that all of this evidence about deterrence, one way or another, is totally inconsequential and unconvincing. You can't demonstrate, you can't win or lose the argument based on deterrence. It's an irrelevant argument. And then there's the international law. argument that you want to be part of you want to be on the right side of history. And I think that's a persuasive one as well. So I'm at 4. Will that do?
Thanks very much. Joshua Rosenberg. Can we talk about the United States? Because those arguments about international law may not resonate in quite the same way. I mean, you spoke at the beginning about young people looking at instruments of torture, for example, and putting the death penalty on the same level. I mean, the main part of your talk was along the lines of lots of countries have abolished the death penalty. That's great, and that's a trend. But many of those countries have changed. They've either moved towards democracy or they've had revolutions or they have changed in some ways. The United States hasn't gone through any recent revolution, and the southern states in the United States that do retain the death penalty don't seem to be showing any real sign of wanting to abolish it. I accept your figures, the numbers are going down, but there are still substantial numbers, and just as there are Americans who think it's perfectly normal to do things we would find extraordinary in this country, such as carrying a handgun or keeping a gun in the bedside table, there are many Americans who think it's perfectly normal to use the death penalty. So are you relying on public opinion changing in those states in the United States? Certainly a Democrat president hasn't persuaded these states. Or is it a Supreme Court decision that you're looking for which would be binding on the entire United States? And can you actually see that, even with a change of the makeup of the Supreme Court, actually leading to the abolition of the death penalty throughout the United States in the next decade?
Yes, thank you, Joshua, for that question. There is very measurable change in the United States. I mentioned one example, but there are several others. The decision on imposing the death penalty is a decision that juries are to make. So juries impose the death penalty about half as often as they did a decade ago. Prosecutors ask for it a lot less, partly because they don't want to find themselves with a jury that's going to acquit somebody, because they don't want to impose the death penalty if they think it's mandatory or is likely to be imposed. Several states in the United States have now, in the last half dozen years, gone from the death penalty into the abolitionist camp. So there are a number of indicators of movement. Of course, in a way, with the United States, we also have the problem we have globally, which is the hardcore. We want to get at those hardcore states. One way to knock them out, of course, is with a Supreme Court decision. It's one of the great ironies. The United States has come so close on 2 occasions to judicial abolition of the death penalty. Back in the 1970s, in the Furman decision, which stopped the death penalty, but didn't close the door shut, left it ajar, and then they managed to push it open again. And then perhaps an even more significant decision in the 1980s, the McCleskey decision, where the Supreme Court rejected the argument about racial bias in the death penalty by 5-4. And the judge, who was the swing judge in it, a few years later, retired from the bench and said it was the biggest mistake he ever made. Just by a hair, very close. One of the judges who often voted on the death penalty side of the court also left and made this famous statement about how he would no longer tinker with the machinery of death. He waited till the end of his term to start doing it. In the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States dealing with juvenile executions in 2005, where they finally declared them to be unconstitutional, there's kind of a roadmap of what you need to get rid of the death penalty altogether. And the decisive thing for the Supreme Court would seem to be the fact that there is perceptible change in the policies of the states. They don't have to get to a majority of states that have abolished the juvenile death penalty. All they have to do is see a trend, and then they'll be able to issue an abolitionist judgment and keep a straight face. So I would see that, thinking strategically, as being the way to go. But the other thing, you said there's no revolution, there's no earth-shaking change in the United States. You don't think the election of Obama is a bit of a revolution in the United States? Think not of this first election, but his re-election when he won Texas. Now, I often hear people say, Texas will be the last place on earth. They'll still have the death penalty. Texas is Democratic now. It's gone back to the Democrats, and it's no longer the racist Democrats of the 1950s. It's the progressive Democrats of Obama and Bill Clinton. And it's more and more Latin American. I think it's just a matter of time before Texas goes like Mexico. I mean, not to secede from the United States and join Mexico, but I would bet that of the hardcore states that practice the death penalty, political change in Texas is likely that might bring an end to it. Well, we're still young. I'll see you in 10 years, and you can call me on that bet.
Thank you. I'm from Penal Reform International. My name is Oliver Robertson. I know that you're speaking about the broad sweep, and I keep seeing a couple of bumps in the road ahead with some of the hardest of the hardcore. What you might call countries which are fairly isolated and seem not to take much heed of the rest of the world. You might call it a North Korea problem. And countries which are fairly rich and powerful and seem to continue their own furrow. You might call it a Saudi Arabia problem. Do you have any thoughts on how to deal with such places?
North Korea? I don't know what to think about North Korea. I do think that there should be a rule against executing your uncle. I mean, I think we should put that in the next international treaty. But obviously there's something very mysterious going on in North Korea, and there has to be some very dramatic form of political change. We can take heart in the fact that there was, once upon a time, there were many countries that resembled North Korea politically, and most of them have not survived. So it's probably just a matter of time. The countries in the Middle East are also, their own particular problems. You didn't mention Belarus. I was waiting for you to talk about our little European anomaly of Belarus, but that too just seems to be, it's almost the exception that proves the rule, and it can't take very long for that to happen. I do think one of the things that's happening as the numbers shrink of states that continue to use the death penalty, it becomes harder and harder to generalize, because there are just fewer and fewer states. We're increasingly looking at a group of sui generis environments now where it's hard to see patterns as much as was once the case. So I don't have any, I'm just an academic. I watch change. I don't provoke it. I don't strategize. So I think Ed had a question there.
Yes. Just a second.
Yes. Thank you very much for a brilliant speech. But can you talk about China a bit, about how you see it going in China, and whether we're really getting accurate figures from there about what is going on?
Yes, certainly. I probably know as much about the death penalty in China as anybody outside of China, because I've been going there probably twice a year for the last decade to conferences on capital punishment. Some of them quite official, some of them more academic, but if I go there now to a conference that someone else organizes, I'm likely to know half the people in the room because they're all the usual suspects. I've been at people from the academy, from government, from the bar, and I've watched the evolution there in terms of the discourse to be very dramatic over the last decade. So that the official position now in China is that the goal is to abolish the death penalty. They didn't say that 10 years ago. And obviously we're light years ahead of the United States, where they don't say the national goal is to abolish the death penalty. In China they say it's the goal, and they say it's a matter of time, but they're not within my 1 decade horizon. They're talking about maybe 3 decades. But again, who knows things? It's a highly centralized regime. When they decide to change something, it will happen just like that. The numbers, we don't have numbers. We just don't have any numbers from China. They say it's a state secret. There are a variety of estimates that float around. Amnesty International used to provide an estimate. Apparently they did it. Someone who worked at Amnesty International would look up close at one region of China, study the press, make an assessment of how many were executed, and then they would gross up the numbers to take account of the 1.4 billion. And Amnesty would get to a number around 2,000, a little less, I think, in the last report. But about 4 years ago, I don't know whether it's because Amnesty took a strategic decision or because the person who did the calculations left and no one else wanted to do it. But Amnesty said they're not going to do it anymore. So we don't have a figure from them. There are some NGOs that monitor China who talk about 10,000. But that's such a round number as to not be very convincing and probably at odds with the Amnesty information, which is at least has a modicum of science to it. I have an educated guess that it's around 3,000. I've often tried it out in China with people there, and they sort of nod or smile knowingly. We don't even know whether they know, actually. We don't even know whether they keep count and whether they know. It's China. It's a bit like the United States. It's quite regional. In the United States, we know it's not just down to a handful of states, it's down to a handful of counties in those states. So, Texas, it's not all of Texas that executes, it's just a few counties. And they had one where they changed the prosecutor and the death rate in Texas dropped dramatically because they changed the prosecutor in one county. China may be like that too. I suspect that it's quite regional. I suspect that they don't know. They are very proud of the fact that they've made legislative changes. One of them I think when we look at it, it seems to be insignificant. It's not very convincing. They say, we've reduced the number of offenses for which the death penalty can be imposed. So smuggling of fossils is now no longer a capital crime, but I don't know how many people were executed for smuggling fossils in the past. So they knocked a bunch of crimes off the list, and then they sort of say, aren't we doing well? But they're still executing people for economic offenses, for drug crimes, and of course for murder and so on. But when I've been dismissive of this in China, I say, come on, this isn't really very serious. You took a few of these trivial crimes that are never prosecuted. They say, oh no, it's very significant. So there's a sense that it's maybe a symbolic move that indicates that greater change is afoot. The other thing that they've done, and people in China say it's reduced the death penalty by more than 50%, is to require that all death sentences be approved by the Supreme Court. And so that has apparently had a very dramatic effect. So I think it's a positive story in China, but it's still far and away the biggest executioner in the world. Ultimately, many of these countries that hang on to the death penalty are repressive, politically reactionary countries, and they hang on to not only the death penalty but other measures of harsh criminal justice for reasons that have nothing to do with crime prevention, tradition, or anything. It's all about keeping the lid on the politics of the country. I think that probably explains Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Korea and China.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Layden. I'm moved to intervene by the mention of fossils, which caused my ears to prick up. I work in an obscure corner of the Foreign Office where my activities are, for the most part, harmless and have to do with managing our policy to encourage abolition of the death penalty. And I'm very grateful to you, Professor Shabas, and also to the Death Penalty Project for the work that you all do. I think that if the Death Penalty Project did not exist, then someone like me would probably have to sit down and think of inventing it. So it's very good that I have been spared that trouble, because I'm not sure that I'd have been clever enough to have the idea. However, I would like to express our recognition in the Foreign Office for all the work that's done by academics, lawyers, civil society, churches and many other people in support of the work that we try to do as a government to promote the abolition of the death penalty. Our ministers are genuinely interested in this policy, and we're really keen to do what we can to support your efforts. So my question is a little bit self-interested. I'd like to ask you, if you were to be asked to finish a sentence which began, "I wish the British government would," what would it be? I'm very curious to know that.
A friend of mine from Canada wrote me the other day saying, "You should be very careful about criticizing the British government, or something bad will happen to you in that country." Well, let me, Christopher, you thanked the activists, the lawyers, the faith-based groups and so on, the academics who were involved in it. Let me thank the diplomats and the foreign offices of not just the United Kingdom, but it stands out for having an experienced senior professional assigned to work on death penalty issues. I know that Spain has had an ambassador on the issue at different times, France as well, I think. Many countries have taken this as a very serious part of their foreign policy and have made significant investments in terms of both personnel and financially, and political. They've used their own political capital at the international level to promote abolition. That's something that we didn't really have a dozen years ago, 15 years ago, and that, I think, has made a significant contribution as well. There's a lot of arm twisting that has to be done in the General Assembly on that resolution. Every 2 years, there's a resolution now in the General Assembly. It started in 2007. It gets a progressively greater majority every year by a few countries, 2 or 3 countries, but a country like the United Kingdom can probably inflict just a little bit of diplomatic pain on a country to tip them into the abstentionist, or maybe even to vote in favor of the resolution, and that would be very significant. Something, let me just say about that resolution that has intrigued me, not the last resolution, but the one before that. They're now adopted in even years, so it'll be November, December of 2014, the next resolution. The last one was 2012, and the one before that was December of 2010. And I remember when that resolution was adopted, we all said, "Isn't this great?" There are four or five more countries that have moved either from the no to the abstainer or from the abstainer to the yes category, and they're Arab countries in the Middle East. And that was in early December of 2010. Now, I didn't see anything except I thought that was interesting. But someone who was really sharp would have looked at that and said, something is happening in the Arab world. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the Arab Spring begins. It was almost as if it was a precursor of greater political change, that resolution. So I think that resolution, aside from all the other things that the United Kingdom does, I'm sure you could sort of target 1 or 2 countries and pick them off and get them to shift on the resolution.
Right, I think with that, any more questions? Sorry. Yes, there is.
Hi, Bill. A quick question. We made reference to the European Court of Human Rights and the US Supreme Court, and I wanted to tap into the other body of law that you know much about international criminal law. So at Nuremberg, people were still received the death sentence. Eichmann, I think, received the death sentence. And the current international criminal legal system is pretty much predicated on the fact that the death penalty shouldn't be used. How do you see this feature in this entire narrative?
The elimination of the death penalty at the International Criminal Tribunal level has been significant, influential. It's added an argument to the toolbox of those who are campaigning for abolition within countries. The reasons are somewhat complex, and people, I think, to be quite fair, occasionally have exaggerated the significance or maybe have underestimated all of the factors that are at work. When the International Criminal Court decided not to include the death penalty, it was partly because states understood that with so many abolitionist countries, you could not have an international institution that had the death penalty. It was more about international cooperation than it was about representing a commitment by all the states of opposition to the death penalty. I don't want to suggest it was insignificant, but that factor was present as well. It is a factor that also comes into play, going right back to the Suring case, it's the 25th anniversary this year, 25 years ago, that the death penalty now is a complication for states in their mutual legal assistance and all of the issues relating to cooperation in international criminal justice. And some of them just, they don't need it. I'm sure that in the United States, in the State Department and in the Justice Department, the people who are dealing with extradition and mutual legal assistance, they just wish the death penalty would go away because it would make their jobs easier. It would make law enforcement at the international level more effective, reliable, predictable, and swift.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for effectively a second lecture with the answers to those questions.
Thank you for
which we're very grateful. Thank you very much.